Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Maria Gagliardi, and I'm the director of the Palisades Library, and I'd like to welcome you to our Palisades People Sunday Symposium. We've been doing this for 10 years, bringing our neighbors together to hear one another's stories and to share the things that we're passionate about. Today, we're delighted to host Palisades Resident Greta Nettleton, who has written a family biography that received the 2018 Library Association of Rockland County's Book of the Year Award. Greta will give a presentation on her book, and then we'll have a conversation with local author Bethany Ball about the book and the writing process. We'll then open up the floor for questions, and we also have a copy of books by both Bethany Ball and Greta to raffle off today. Bethany Ball's first novel, just out in paperback, What to Do About the Solomons, follows a Jewish family through the 20th century and a financial scandal. In the New York Times Summer Reading Recommendations, Judy Blume wrote of the novel, "There's nothing more exciting as a bookseller or reader discovering a new writer who creates memorable characters in a setting we don't see every day. Funny, sexy, and smart." Please welcome Bethany Ball.
So I was the judge for the, is this too loud? Am I good? Okay. I was a judge for the Library Association Award, and Greta's book was just really a knockout. So I just had a few things that I wanted to say about her book. The Quack's Daughter is the Victorian-era biography of Cora Keck, a Midwestern new money and not terribly serious young woman who escapes the scandal of her mother's successful patent business and stuffy constraints of her familial home for the opportunity to study at Vassar College. Author Greta Nettleton, through her great-grandmother's memorabilia, letters, and diaries, has written an expansive, extraordinary book that delves into the mores and constraints of the age. She has triumphed doing the very things so many people threaten to do. She has written the story of a fabled, somewhat notorious ancestor, and she's done this brilliantly. And I want to introduce Greta up here to start her presentation.
Thank you all for coming today. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to see everybody. And I'm also thrilled for the recognition from the Library Association of Rockland County. It's just wonderful. So I know that some of you here might have already read the book. So I'm giving a talk that covers material that's in the first book, but my main goal today is to link it to a writing project I'm working on right now, which is a follow-up. The second book is going to be called The Charmed Line, between various different things. This week I'm calling it The Charmed Line Between Vice and Medicine. And it's going to be a prequel, and I'm focusing on the life of Cora's mother. And when I've been speaking about the book in many venues, many people have asked me, tell me more about her mother. And so I've been working on this. It's taken a lot of research. So the Gilded Age is often mocked, and it's also a glorious age of American history. That's when we put up the Statue of Liberty. That's when the French put up the Eiffel Tower. A lot of brilliant imagination, human imagination, was unleashed. It was an age of lots of vice and virtue, an age of hoaxes and scientific breakthroughs, and an age of quacks and their accusers, and also an age with a lot of very beautiful young women. So, there were also a lot of very successful older professional women, and we're no longer aware of their existence because nobody was interested in writing about their accomplishments. I found out about my family's accomplishments because of Hurricane Katrina. And my sister had this diary in New Orleans where she lived, and she mailed a bunch of treasures back to me in New York. And they escaped the flooding, And so it came into my possession, this diary, and all these photo albums. And the photo albums were filled with faces and nothing written about who the people are, which was typical, because in those days people got together in social groups and they looked at the photo albums in a group. So they talked about all the people. It was a social media without the internet. So I had to find out who all the people were. So that was part of my writing process, was researching the ancestors who might be in the books and finding out who their friends were. So what I discovered was a lost story of an extraordinary family. And this is my great-grandmother, Cora Keck. And she was about 11 years old. And she was born and raised in Fairfield, Iowa. So she was born in 1865 in May. And in those days, people gave birth at home. And I was lucky to find, where is it? There we go. This amazing picture of what it was like to have a baby in those days. You just sit on a straight back chair in the living room. But what you had was a lot of friends and neighbors looking after you for hours and hours and hours and hours before, and then for as long as you needed afterwards. Nobody ever did this alone, except for the unfortunate ladies on the wagon trains. And so tend to have bigger families in towns than you did camping out on the prairie. And in those days, all nursing was done by the women of the family. It was understood that was part of what a woman did. Nobody paid anything for anything. So only the midwife was given a fee. Cora's mother probably hired Fairfield's midwife, Rachel Pierce. In her career, Rachel delivered 1,000 babies without a single fatality. And this extraordinary accomplishment is documented in the Journal of the Iowa Medical Society. But do we know about her? No. So the medical profession at the time of Cora's birth and at the time of Cora's mother's birth was kind of a rough-hewn activity. It was the nation's least prestigious profession, and if your children were too dumb to get into the classics program at college, the fallback position was medical school. So, and the doctors studied a medical curriculum that lasted 4 months, and it mainly consisted of memorizing texts from Avicenna and from Hippocrates and ancient Greek and medieval sources. So the medicine that they were learning is something that we would no longer wish to undergo today. So I don't know if you ever heard about getting something up the cleister. Here's a cleister, this thing. So number one activity the doctors did was to give you this calomel, which would make you, this is an extreme laxative, or you get a cleister, or you get something that made you throw up, or both. And then they would bleed people, and they'd take out pints and pints and pints of blood till you fainted. So it was pretty rough-hewn. And all this suffering caused a reaction. So there was something called the medical reform movement in the 1840s, and a lot of people thought that regular medicine really wasn't useful, and they tried to look for alternatives. So, yeah, regrettably, a lot of people died from the treatments. So anyways, in 1825, homeopathy was brought to America, predominantly because of influence from German immigrants. The original inventor of homeopathy, Hahnemann, was a German academic, and this is an allegorical painting, and on the right we have the virtuous homeopathic theory, and on the left we have the horrendous suffering of typical regular medicine of people. Here's the patient, you can see they're chopping him up and shoving horrible things in his mouth. And This medical reform movement had many other varieties. There was eclectic medicine, there was Thomsonian medicine, there was hydropathy, and many of these alternatives were well patronized by women, and they were open to women. They ran medical schools that admitted women. So at that time, the medical reform movement and the women's rights movement were practically synonymous. So there was a lot of overlap. So Cora's father was an engineer, an inventor, and he ran a foundry in Fairfield, and he was a political progressive. So this is at the Progressive Grange publication where he ran his ads, and it was a typical scene of outdoor harvesting activity, and so he was kind of a mechanical genius, and he won prizes, and he was doing very well, but this is a bad year to be in that business because there was a terrible banking panic in New York, and it caused financial collapse all over the country. So his foundry collapsed and went out of business, and he had 6 children and no one to support them. So meanwhile, after the Civil War, a lot of very liberal political reforms took place, and in addition to civil rights in the South for blacks, we also had a great increase in civil rights for women, particularly in the North. And so in 1873, married women were allowed to have an independent business separate from their husband's identity. And lucky for Mrs. Dr. Keck, because suddenly she had to step in and support her family at this exact moment. So she was a devout Methodist. There's a typical Methodist church in the area. Unfortunately, the one in Fairfield is bulldozed. It's not there, so I had to get another picture. So the Methodists were famous for supporting very unpopular activities like women's rights, no drinking, no dancing, but they, besides being moralizers, they really supported a woman's right to support herself and to work. And throughout her career, Mrs. Dr. Keck made a lot of connections with Methodists who helped her business. They were essential in supporting her. And they were effective too, because by 1875, she was running ads in the Chicago Times, and she had an office on this street, a rented office, and she was selling her cure that she used on her family in bottles, a tonic called a catarrh cure. And catarrh is simply an old-fashioned word for congestion or phlegm, infected phlegm. So she built her business up by the 1880s. She was mailing out something like 12,000 to 15,000 customers. She was mailing remedies out each year. She had temporary offices. She moved from office to office over a territory, all of central Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and eastern Iowa. So the scale of her business became extremely large. By 1875, in April, she bought a large piece of land in Davenport from the Methodist Church. So again, her connections were very, very useful to her. Meanwhile, she was making a lot of enemies in Fairfield among the doctors, and they were very jealous that she earned so much money, and it was creating a terrible scandal. And a lot of people turned against her. And right before she moved out of town, she took a stroll around the town square in a pair of bloomers. And so I found some bloomers online. Bloomers in those days were incredibly provocative, sort of a mirror upside down image of wearing a burqa on a French beach. Really, really made people upset. And so it made the newspapers, and it was this doctor, called Dr. J. Fred Clark in Davenport, who became, in Fairfield, who later became the president of the Iowa State Medical Society, actually wrote in the paper a number of times about how horrified he was as a boy to see this hideous sight. So at the time, women in wagon trains sometimes wore pants because their skirts would blow in the campfires and they'd get, they'd burn up. Or this woman is wonderful. Dr. Mary E. Walker was a surgeon in the Civil War. She was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for her courage. And she refused to take off her bloomers. She wore them all her life. And unfortunately, in 1917, her Congressional Medal of Honor was revoked on account of her gender, along with her pension. So in any case, Mrs. Dr. Keck decided to leave Fairfield because the place was just very hostile to her. So she moved to Davenport, where she had connections with the Methodist Church. And at the time, Davenport was a very important rail junction. This bridge took the main rail line across the Mississippi that then went to the Pacific. The same rail line with the golden spike. I guess it was the Union Pacific. They change the names frequently. I don't know the exact railroad name. And so we see it was kind of a wild city. There were 130 brothels and bars. And we have here a picture of some people enjoying a drink before going upstairs to the brothel. And the place was very rough and wild, but also good for business. So she was up against, Mrs. Dr. Keck was selling her tonic. She was advertising in the newspapers. And in all the same newspapers, we had all these people who were legitimately crooks and selling the proverbial snake oil. Fake doctors often make use of images of Indians because pioneers had learned so much real medical wisdom from Indian medicine men that was a very powerful advertising symbol. So this guy, Mrs. Dr. Keck, crossed paths with him while she was being prosecuted by the Illinois State Medical Society, and he ran a lovely, entertaining show that involved pulling people's teeth out, and he could take a tooth out in 40 seconds. So Mrs. Dr. Keck opened up for business in Davenport on Brady Street, and the next block up from her new office was this elegant-looking mansion. And this infirmary opened the same year, and it was being operated by the secretary of the Scott County Medical Society, Dr. Edward Hazen, and he was an eye and ear specialist. And you can see he had this engraving made, and this engraving was published in, it's off the edge here, in the Andreas Atlas of Iowa in 1876, and he ran it in newspapers. And he got into terrible trouble with the other people in the medical society because they disapproved very strongly of his advertising. So, in fact, he quit right before they were going to throw him out of the medical society because he refused to stop running these ads. Another interesting thing about Davenport is that Davenport had a number of very successful, well-respected women physicians. And these three women pictured were all regular women physicians, having gone through regular medical school training. In the 1870s, American medical schools were dramatically improved from how they had been in the 1840s. And we see here Dr. Delilah Irish. She had gone to Women's Medical College of Philadelphia, graduated in 1868, and she became a protege of the famous Emily Blackwell in New York City. And Emily's sister, there were two of them. There was Emily, there's another Blackwell, Elizabeth Blackwell. And so she received excellent training from the Blackwells and returned to Davenport. She was the first woman admitted to the Scott County Medical Society. And then on the left, we have Dr. Cleves. She also went on to a very important international career as a neurologist and a skin specialist. And she graduated with the first class from the University of Iowa Medical School. And this is her protege, Dr. McCowan. All three of these women were in the Scott County Medical Society, and all three of them were very well respected. Okay, there's no picture here, because I couldn't find one, of Dr. Porter, Dr. Mariah Porter, who was a Quaker homeopath, and she also had a very solid career, supported her family of 5 children. She was a widow, and she lived in Davenport for 30 years. And so very well respected, very successful long-term practice as a woman physician. She was also the vice president of the Iowa Woman Suffrage organization at that time. So the University of Iowa Medical School was opened in 1871, and Mrs. Dr. Keck theoretically could have applied to go if she wanted to become a certified physician. The first class graduated in 1873, and they forced the women to have separate pictures on the outside of the rim of the ceremonial plate. They didn't let them sit in a regular picture. But nevertheless, there they were. But we can wonder why she didn't do that. One is, she probably found that the idea of taking 2 years off to go to medical school while supporting her 6 children and husband was impossible financially. And the second reason is that the hostility she felt from the regular doctors in Fairfield would have made her feel a negative sense about the medical school. And the third thing is they probably would not have admitted her for that very same reason. So Miss Dr. Keck was having to make all these bottles of tonic and send them off to patients or customers. The terminology is loaded, at increasing volumes. So how the heck could she do it? I'm sure in the beginning, the family all did it around the kitchen table, and a lot of the tonics were brewed on the stove. But as she got more successful, the volume was certainly impossible. So the first thing that she did was open a small patent medicine company in Fairfield, probably in the empty foundry building, because her husband's business had collapsed. Then she met this guy, Cyrenius Wakefield, in Bloomington, Illinois, and this is Dr. Wakefield's factory. So we got a lot of capacity here. And so he must have taken over all the manufacturing and fulfillment of the various remedies that she was prescribing to her patients. And the Wakefield family, there were 4 children, and they all became very close friends of Cora Keck. And so I know the business relationship must have been a very important one. I have mementos of all the Wakefield kids in our trunk. So meanwhile, by 1879, Mrs. Dr. Keck became so powerful that she was able to buy that same mansion from the creditors who owned it, and Dr. Hazen had lost his lease, and he had to move out. And his infirmary was closed, and she reopened 3 weeks later with her infirmary, which is called Mrs. Dr. Keck's Infirmary for All Chronic Diseases. So in a lot of ways, what she was doing was not very different from what the regular physicians were doing. They were searching for ways to commercialize the way medicine was practiced at the time. So, and I am fortunate to have some photographs of the interior of the house. So this is the living room, and you can see that's Mrs. Dr. Keck and her husband in these portraits, and there's a lot of very fancy carpeting and paneling and so forth. It's pretty elegant. Out of everything that was in that house, it's the only thing I have left. So, and she paid cash $12,000 at the time she bought it, and it created this enormous scandal in town. The respectable people were horrified. The medical society was horrified. Dr. Hazen was back in the medical society. He later became a president of it. So again, she seemed to have made some enemies here, and she seems to have proceeded regardless of that. So then her schedule was very, very grueling. She was a workaholic. She traveled 3 weeks out of every 4. The trains in those days took you to anywhere you wanted to go. And she would go to a town, she'd rent a room in a nice hotel in the middle of town, advertise that she was there, and she would stay from anywhere from 4 days to a week and a half. And patients would come and line up, and she'd sit down and visit with every single patient. Having listened to what they had to say, she would prescribe certain kinds of remedies from the selection that she had. It's very difficult to know what these remedies were, because unlike the quack patent medicine people, that wasn't the main thing. She was a physician. She didn't put pictures of bottles in her ads. She didn't even describe them in her ads, because that's not really what she was selling. She was selling her expertise. So as a result, I've found out very little about what the actual remedies were. But she tried to see each patient every 2 months. So she did a circuit. She'd be in a hotel, she'd be gone, and then 2 months later she'd be back. And the patients could come back and discuss their progress at that time. So, and then her husband was essential, because there were all these kids to be looked after. So he leaned in and he looked after the children, and he also listed himself as a physician in 1877, and he seems to have come up with a cure for hemorrhoids as well. So as the 2 eldest daughters grew to adulthood, they became important executives in the family business. And the oldest, Belle Keck Alexander, was already suing people at age 29. She became very powerful and litigious. She had a real taste for diamonds. And she married a lawyer who was supposed to help the family. He was not very competent, and then she divorced him. So, and then her sister Lotta was much more of a people person, and she ran one of the family, one of Mrs. Dr. Keck's offices in Peoria, and she married a doctor, and they tried to perhaps regularize the practice there, because her husband, Dr. Dorn, had a real MD degree, and she also did all the advertising schedules, which were very complicated. I did Google searches for years, and I found something like 1,500 ads from 30 or 40 newspapers in 15 or 20 towns. And so you can imagine what's been wiped out by time. So we could probably at least double that or triple that. So it's a lot of advertising. So, interestingly enough, she was very popular. And the editors in the newspapers were very favorable. She had a personal rapport with people in the news business that was something really special. Because even before she was wealthy and famous, she got her ads run on the front pages of papers, and she got these editorial endorsements from different editors all over. She was praised for being a beacon for women's freedom. She was praised for being tough. She was praised for being likable, and she was praised for her charity. So she was not the kind of, she was obviously the kind of person who paid her bills, made good connections, and was considered to be a serious businesswoman and well respected by many people. Nevertheless, she continued to make enemies. And the next biggest battle she had was with the Illinois State Board of Health, which was created in 1877. And before that, there was no regulation whatsoever. Anybody who wanted to be a doctor could be a doctor. We had a libertarian paradise in America. All you had to do was have customers, and if people paid and said you were a doctor, you were a doctor. So Mrs. Dr. Keck considered herself to be a doctor based on that. But the medical profession was trying to straighten things up in the 1870s. So this new Board of Health decided to clean house in Illinois and get rid of everybody who was an illegitimate doctor. So in the first year, they got rid of about 1,700 doctors. And Mrs. Dr. Keck refused to leave Illinois. And this powerful man, Dr. Rauch, became one of her most dogged persecutors. He considered her to be a fraud and a disgrace. And in an article in the Chicago Tribune, he referred to her as foul and damnable in every way. And the capital letters, very modern kind of Twitter talk, were actually in the newspaper. So she actually ended up being arrested 4 times in Illinois on the street. Very humiliating thing for a Methodist housewife. Each time she was able to pay bail and get out. She had a good lawyer, and she took the doctors who were prosecuting her to court and fought tooth and nail in each case. And some towns, it was very localized. In some towns she won, in some towns she lost. So it was kind of, let's say, an even battle. She was not a victim, but they were always after her in every place. Peoria is a big mystery for me. The guy who went after her the most in Peoria was a gynecologist, and his name was Dr. Will, and that's a name you cannot Google because it's a verb. So I've been looking for him, but I don't know how to search because his name doesn't show up anywhere. I mean, it shows just the words show up, so that's too bad. He wrote this diary his whole life, and if it could be found, it would be fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So part of what drives me in this research is trying to figure out what kind of a person she was. Because when I started out on the research, I was going on family tradition, and my grandfather had been Mrs. Dr. Keck's son-in-law. So, he married, he married Cora's daughter. So he knew of Mrs. Dr. Keck through repute. He never met her. But my grandfather had a very low opinion of her. And so our family always, when I was growing up, kind of mocked her. And we have this sugar bowl, which says Mrs. Dr. Keck on it. And so we always kind of made fun of it. And it's not very beautiful either. So, and at the time, we all said, well, there were no women doctors back then. She couldn't have been a doctor. She had to be a phony. So how a truth like that, accepted by children at the breakfast table, can turn into an examination of how history is done, that's part of why I'm looking into this, because our false assumptions can sometimes block us from understanding what actually was the truth at the time. So back to Cora. So Cora was an incredibly gifted musician. She studied in Davenport with this wonderful Dr. Bronwyn, Professor Hugo Bronwyn. And Hugo Bronwyn had been born and raised in Dresden in the early part of the 19th century. And he was a contemporary of Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner. And in fact, Richard Wagner and Bronwyn were both young firebrand revolutionaries in Dresden during the Revolution of 1848, and they were both thrown into exile. So he was forced to go to the United States, and he ended up in a small town on the Mississippi, which was probably kind of a depressing situation. But he became one of the, this fantastic musician and music instructor, and he probably knew Liszt personally, and he assigned Cora a number of pieces by Liszt, and Cora saved all her music, bound it into a book, and I still have it. And it has his handwriting and his assignments and the dates. And so he assigned her this Rigoletto da Verdi. It's like if you took all the music in Rigoletto and squashed it into a single piano piece, that's it. So there's a lot of notes. It's a very difficult piece. These are never played anymore. And she was playing this as a teenager before she went to college. So she was obviously brilliant. But I didn't believe that at one of my talks. I called up the Yale School of Music and I said, oh, I have this piece. If you could send somebody out who could just play it, I don't think it's too hard. And I said what it was, and they said, oh my gosh, it'd take one of our top people 3 months to learn that. So this is very serious stuff. Answered my question about was Cora a dilettante musician or not. I would say no. So here she is, a teenager playing this incredible music in this sort of awful frontier town filled with bars and brothels. And the local, well-educated social people have turned their backs on the family because her mother is being arrested on the street in Illinois. So what to do with this girl? They send her off to Vassar. Vassar's so desperate. They're going broke. In 1 year, they lost, I can't do the percentage in my head, but they're slipping fast. And so Vassar basically, at that point, was willing to take as a student anybody who would pay the $800 a year to go. And it was a lot of money. In equivalent modern times, it's about the same as now, $80,000. So Mrs. Dr. Keck was capable of spending that much money to send one of her daughters to Vassar. She's making a lot of money. And here we see this huge building filled with dormitory rooms, and this is the size of the graduating class in 1884. So you can see that they're really in trouble. Here's Cora's acceptance letter. It was handwritten by the president of the college. Dear Madame, the certificate of your daughter's work has been received. Blah, 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 blah. Please don't forget to send your check. So here is her memorable date of entrance. So Cora went off to college by herself on the train, and it's a 600-mile trip. So we tend to think of Victorian women as these helpless, simpering maidens. In truth, most people were operating with a great deal of independence outside of the South. The simpering part is very much a Southern thing. But the Northern women were free to travel, and they did. She was given a dorm room in one of the least popular parts of the building in the basement on the north quarter. So Vassar didn't see her as one of the most desirable students either. So there's a picture of her dorm room. It's just, I can't get over how amazing it is that I have all these images. But the family was just so thrilled by all of this stuff. It's a great thing about being a nouveau riche. It's like, here's a picture of what we did. So most people might not have paid the extra the extra cost to have these pictures taken, but lucky for me, they did. So you can see the gas chandelier has this pipe going down to the lamp on the table, and they played banjo. They were buying all these Japanese imports at the gift shop. They played tennis. There's so many clues about a lifestyle hidden in this dorm room. It's very cool. And Cora was extroverted. She had a lot of friends. I know a lot about her social life from all these things she saved in her scrapbooks. And one thing I discovered when I went to the Vassar library was this strange thing that the same year Cora went to Vassar, another girl from Davenport went there. And yet there was no mention of that girl anywhere in Cora's papers. And this was a young lady named Elizabeth Briggs, and her father was a wealthy, prominent lawyer, and they obviously lived in totally separate social strata and never talked to each other. And Elizabeth Briggs left her scrapbook to Vassar too, and I just said, oh my God. I went to the library, get me that thing right now, I gotta see it. They lost it. Anyways, so it's gone. Maybe someday somebody will find it. So here's Cora's famous diary. It was written in handwriting. It was very hard to read. I spent a lot of time writing it out, and it gave me her voice and her personality, which was utterly charming, and also how her relationship with her friends and who she was writing letters to and everything. It was just great. Her first roommate was Marion Austin. She's the one who gave her the diary. And both Marion and Cora were super athletic, and they played tennis, and they were very good at it. They dominated the tennis court. This picture was taken the year they were there. I don't know if they're in this picture, but this is exactly how tennis was played when they were at Vassar. So it was a big fad all over the United States. And this woman played a huge role in making Cora the woman that she became. Jessie Capen was Cora's piano instructor, and she was herself a graduate of Vassar in the 1870s. She'd been to Germany to study. She came back. As a woman, she was never hired as a professor, only as an instructor. But nevertheless, she gave the best of what she had to her students. And she, having identified Cora as a student with real talent, she was very hard on her. And some of the other students with no talent, she was very gracious and said, oh, that's lovely. You know, just do the next piece. And however, Cora, she really drove her very hard. And she made Cora turn from a girl with no goals into a person who took her own music very seriously. So it was kind of a miracle. She's just a dramatically wonderful person, this Jessie Capen. But when I first read about her in the diary, I thought she was kind of a fiend because she really was hard on Cora. So Cora loved going into New York City. She had a close friend, Kitty Rogers, who lived in this house in Manhattanville at 134th Street overlooking the Hudson River, which is where the Roberto Clemente apartment building is right now. And how did Kitty's family have money to send her to Vassar? Well, her father was in the Tweed ring. He was a crooked lumber contractor, and he made lots of money that way. And so here's the tourist sites at the time, Brooklyn Bridge and Wall Street. So Vassar daily life was regulated by the lady principal, Miss Abby Goodsell. And she was Vassar's eyes and ears. She, oh yeah, it's a strict way of life that's completely vanished. The bells started ringing at 7 in the morning. And after each bell, there was a 4-minute later, there was a tardy bell, and life was very regulated, and everybody had to be in bed by 10 at night. So it was pretty healthy, let's say, a little regimented, and just a way of life that we don't see anymore. So Cora, of course, liked to defy authority, and she disobeyed just about everything. They would hang a raincoat over the window of the door and keep their lights on and stay up late. Because she was on the ground floor, she could climb out her window and leave campus anytime she wanted, particularly after lights out. And she did that repeatedly. She would climb out the window, go into Poughkeepsie, go to the roller rink. She would sign herself out of college and go into New York City. This is the Dakota, and this is the elevated rail line, I think, on 7th Avenue, 8th Avenue, I'm not sure. But you can see how strange New York City looked then compared to how it is today. Okay, so this is where I get to read to you from the Lady Principal's confidential reports. So the Lady Principal thought she was on top of everything. So in the Vassar library, I was able to read Miss Goodsell's private reports to the president of the college at the end of each year, and I felt very nervous reading it because it was super, super secret. And I thought she was going to catch me. But in any case, in May 1885, Miss Goodsell writes, "Dear Sir, we have had no cases of serious discipline this year. Good order and harmony have prevailed through the college to an extent that gives cause for great thankfulness." Well, underneath, behind the scenes, these girls were running all over New York City all the time, and she did not catch them. So, the stakes were high. Some girls did get caught. At the end of 1887, Ms. Goodsell writes, "Early in the college year, a student met two young men in the grounds in the evening and persisted in maintaining a false version of the affair, laying the blame upon others, and made herself an undesirable member of our community. Her parents were asked to remove her from the college." So the stakes were high. If Cora was caught, she was out. But she couldn't resist the bright lights. So another big fad at that time was roller skating, and the guys would do this thing called roller polo that looks pretty rough, and people would pay quite high entry fees to come in and watch in the rinks. So she went to roller skating rinks in Davenport and also in Poughkeepsie and New York City. Another sport that was popular at the time for girls was rowing. So we see here a regatta happening in the 1870s on the East River in New York City, and then Vassar has exactly the same kind of boats. There's Cora at the oars here and her friends. So another thing that Cora experienced while she was at college was a speech by Mark Twain, who came and spoke for Founders Day. And Mark Twain wrote about his memory of coming to Vassar to do this, and he described it to his daughter as a ghastly experience because it was pouring rain and they left him in the cold, and he hated President Caldwell, who was in fact about to be fired. So that same spring, Cora flunked her German exam, and because of that bad grade, Ms. Goodsell told her she could not play her final recital, which went on without her on May 20th. So she was brutally disappointed. And it was a terrible shock to her. They gave her no warning. And so she was terribly depressed. But the next day she went to a party in Marion Austin's dorm room, and she was shaking up the seltzer bottle and spraying everybody. So she bounced back. So the girls would go into Poughkeepsie to a tintype studio, and they'd make these photographs that were like impromptu images, a lot like funny Instagram images. And she kept them all in that messy book with the writing around it that you saw in an earlier slide called a memorabilia. And so they would trade the pictures. So the young men took the pictures of the girls, and the girls took the pictures of the young men. And again, we see a proto version of Instagram or Facebook. Just things couldn't be communicated electronically, but the content and the overall goal was exactly the same, social media. So these two guys, Harvard guys, were really angry. One of them's a type from Yale, I forgot, the other one's from Andover, and they look pretty arrogant. So Cora's closest emotional relationships were with the other women at school, and she had, I can only say it, deep, passionate, bisexual relationships with at least 5 different women. So my favorite picture is this one. Cora's wearing drag, a mustache, and a hat, and a cigar, and a lot of wicks from the music school is posed with her, and Cora says, "My little wife." And then in another picture, Marion Austin calls Cora her little wife, and then the next year, Cora's here posing with a friend, Ned Weeks from Chicago, and she calls Ned her little wife. And the little wife term comes from London, from a book called The Rebel in the Family, which describes the London early life in the lesbian community in London. And in fact, that term, little wife, was very common there. So we can see that this was tolerated at Vassar, and in fact encouraged. And this Goodsell put Ned and Cora together as roommates. So clearly there was no moral judgment, and we know that Miss Goodsell was hired precisely because she was the most morally correct person in America. So obviously it was accepted at the time. So meanwhile, Cora's mother is on trial in Champaign, Illinois, and Cora was very upset because her mother didn't write her for a whole month in the spring of 1886. And this was one of the most serious cases she had. This case lasted 3 years, and the family was in a state of uproar over it, and they didn't tell Cora what was going on. So she was just beside herself with worry. Finally, she graduated that year, and this is the piece she played for a graduation recital. And the New York Times sent a representative who reviewed it and called her performance the gem of the evening. And Mrs. Dr. Keck came and was probably disappointed to discover that her daughter had not somehow blundered into a fashionable marriage with a New York guy. And we can imagine how that would be impossible for Cora under the circumstances. So this is a little bit off the top of the screen, but that same year, Mrs. Dr. Keck obtained a formal certificate from the Iowa State Board of Health saying that she really was a doctor. And this is kind of the high point of her career. And I caught the actual original certificate. Is on microfilm and is very hard to read, so I just typed it out. But I put in all the mistakes, and so notice all the pronouns are he. So she approached retirement in the 1890s, and you can see from her ad later in her career that even though the house didn't really change shape, she had the engraver add a 4th story and this mansard roof and a tower and like 10 extra rooms in the back. That's all fake. There's no such thing on her real building. And right down the street from her, 2 blocks away, here's this other new competitor, Dr. Daniel David Palmer, advertising his new idea about medicine, chiropractic. So he started copying her advertising. But he was kind of a different type of person. He never had the same social acceptance with his community that she did. He never got the endorsements from the newspapers. And in fact, if you go to the Davenport City website today, it mentions their art museum and various other features. The word chiropractic doesn't appear anywhere on the Davenport City website. they're still a little bit unsure about their relationship with the practice of chiropractic. But anyways, this is just down the street from Mrs. Dr. Keck's house. That's the first school of chiropractic, opened in 1897. And at that time, she was all worn out. So Cora had eloped and married this guy and had a little girl and visited them in Florida. And Mrs. Dr. Keck just said, it's over. I'm not going to do this anymore. And nobody carried on after her. She didn't start a school. She never got somebody to be her apprentice and carry on her techniques. She had a medical library, which she left to her daughter Belle, and the medical library disappeared. So we don't know anything about how she thought about her medicines or how she formulated them. So that's a terrible loss. Clearly, there was something fundamentally positive about those treatments because so many people were devoted to them. So part of my research is trying to figure out what kind of treatments she might have used because they were probably based on traditional pioneer treatments. And there is some information about that stuff. So just to sum up at the end, I wanted to talk about professional women in Victorian America. And this picture I got out of a Columbia College or Columbia University yearbook from that same year, I think 1885. And the young man who drew it was drawing a satirical drawing in which he was mocking the girls. And as time goes by, his meaning has been completely changed. And it's easy for us to see that as a picture of a proud woman who's really achieved something important. And I'm looking at American history and seeing a lot of familiar themes, even 150 years ago, that we see coming back even in the present day, especially in the present day. And there's always a cyclical backlash. Interestingly enough, among regular physicians, women who wanted to go to the University of Michigan Medical School, in 1891, 25% of the Michigan Medical School class, entering class, was women. And at that time, it was felt that healthcare was a natural fit for women. Because remember, in the beginning, we saw a slide about how women were in charge of healthcare in a big way of everybody's lives. However, by 1910, the new dean, Victor Vaughn, of the University of Michigan Medical School, had reduced the number of women to 2%. So that number never went back up until the 1960s or 70s, until we had a big reform. So women were eliminated from the healthcare profession in a very overt way in the early 1900s. And so we could look at Victorian women and see that in many ways, they were playing a big role in healthcare that's now been completely forgotten. So anyways, thank you very much for coming, and it's a pleasure for me to be here, and that's all I have to say.
Yeah, so we were going to talk a little bit about the writing process of the book. And I was really especially curious why you chose Cora over Mrs. Dr. Keck. And I can kind of see why. I mean, she had all these wonderful journals and the scrapbooks, and was that the spark that really set you on the path of writing more about Cora? Or
yeah. So the key to everything was that diary. When I first got all the memorabilia, I was just trying to sort it for the benefit of my two sisters. And then I started scanning in some pictures, and I thought I'd write some paragraphs to explain things. And then the paragraphs really ran out of control. And you can see we have some scope creep here because I ended up writing 2 books. But it was very difficult to figure out what the real words mean, because we use the same words today that they used in the 19th century, but the meanings have completely changed. And not only that, meanings are opaque because people use words in a social context, and if the social context is removed, you don't know what they really mean. So if you say, oh, they were Methodists in 1870, that had a whole implication that we no longer know. I mean, to us it's like, oh, well, they go to the church down the street, or, you know, somebody's a temperance agitator. We don't know what temperance means. We don't know what kind of person would do temperance, because that doesn't exist anymore. Nobody is trying to eradicate drinking alcohol. So I had to learn what people were thinking about each other in those days before I could attempt to write a book like this, because it's all about social judgment, and it's all about power, and it's all about, well, scandal is so difficult to study because there's so many lies mixed in with things that might actually be true. And how do you figure out, how do you separate the lies from actual criticism? And it's taken me years of reading and background, looking at all what other doctors did, what education for women was like, before I could begin to understand what Mrs. Dr. Keck was. Because in the beginning I thought she was a crook. That's what everybody told me.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that to me was really a great strength of the book, was that, first of all, I really enjoyed your voice in the book, although it was minimal, but you are like, it's like you had your arm around us and you were sort of discovering these, we were discovering these things with you, and that was really, and you, the way you unfolded the material I thought was really masterful. I mean, I wasn't sure about the doctor for a long time, but there's a moment in the book where Cora is burned, and you describe the burn treatment of the time, and I mean, there were I told my friend this morning, there were doctors who would put varnish on a burn, you know, and all that that Cora's mother did was, you know, sort of your treatment, your basic treatment, keep it dry and clean and lightly bandaged, you know, so she just had this sort of wisdom. But there's a passage which you spoke about, which I thought really highlighted the sort of the journey of the book that we go through. You say about Miss Capen, who was Cora's piano teacher. When I first read about Miss Capen in the diary, I took an instant dislike to her, as her severity tends to conform to everyone's worst image of a grim Victorian disciplinarian spinster. However, the more I learned about the lives of Vassar's earliest alumni, the more I came to appreciate Miss Capen's side of the story. She had good reasons for her harsh response to Cora's work ethic. She had graduated from Vassar School of Music as part of an earlier generation of women who really understood what a miraculous opportunity it was to get an advanced education. And what I enjoyed so much about that is there were so many moments of that where we think we know something, and you thought you knew something, and then we're sort of like is she a good doctor? Was she a good teacher? Was Cora a good student? You know, was she kind of a screw up? I got annoyed with her, but then I started thinking, this is an artist, you know, this is an artistic temperament. This is a time she couldn't succeed as a pianist necessarily, and the frustration of that. And there were just so many, you capture the contradictions so well, and I wonder if that's something you were really conscious of as you were writing?
Yeah, very much so. It's looking for nuggets of something that seemed like a truth it's like looking for candy treats on some kind of an Easter egg hunt. It was, you know, all this vague wall of information which gets so hackneyed and cliched, and I had this incredible sense of thrill every time I push through the curtain and find some fact and realize, oh no, it's a lot like things are today. These people, what makes them tick then is the same stuff that makes us tick now, and that's kind of the key to unlocking all this behavior and unlocking all these judgments and unlocking all the social relationships.
Yeah, I felt that really strongly, and I also was I was jealous of your ability to do so much research and to tell a story. I feel like writers can have one or the other sometimes, but not both. I would love to do more research writing, but it's hard to do the research. But you did a tremendous amount. Did you enjoy one over the other, the storytelling or the research, or both in tandem?
The only way I can get a book written is to go somewhere with no internet. It's really dangerous. I did a lot of Google research. So I'm sorry that I smeared the Vassar Library about losing that scrapbook, because they were actually really helpful and gave me a lot of great information. And they didn't have to. I never set foot in the Vassar campus before I went there. And they didn't think that Cora Keck was an illustrious alumna either. They kind of were like held me at hand's length in other ways. But they were very generous intellectually, and so I want to thank them for that. But Google was so powerful because all this Victorian stuff has been scanned into Google Books, and you can do a search for something unusual, like Mrs. Dr. Keck, and you can find things you would never have found. 20 years ago, could not have written that book. That stuff was unfindable. So then I look up things and find an acquaintance, and now I can find out, then I'll do the name of this other person that she met and find out, like she hired a salesman, and I found out his Civil War record, and all that stuff, and suddenly you have a story to tell about these people that could be so dry on the page without it. But unlike you, the storytelling was something I had to learn to do, because I came deformed by graduate school education, where you're told never to have a story, never to fall in love with your characters, and all these terrible things that ruin your ability to write. So I had to get away from that and learn to tell a story and learn to try to make characters come alive on the page. So that's, for me, the hardest thing I've had to learn.
And so when you finished the book about the mother, the doctor, you're working on it. Yeah, I'm just curious. I guess I was just curious if you felt as compelled by that material of the mother.
Totally.
Yeah, as compelled as Cora, as compelling.
So the slow thing is that I have to create everything myself, because I don't have a single written thing from Mrs. Dr. Keck. I mean, her voice is lost. All I have are her advertisements. And that's a very limited thing to build a human being off a bunch of advertisements. So having done Cora's book first was great, because now I understand what Mrs. Dr. Keck's children were like. And then you work backwards. What was her family like? What were their values? Was she a traveling huckster? Obviously not. You can get some really solid insights into a person by how the whole family dynamics went. So I used my insights into Cora to work backwards to understand Mrs. Dr. Keck. But I also feel like Cora's story is very entertaining, but not very political. And Mrs. Dr. Keck's story is hugely political. And I'm trying very hard to make it entertaining too, because nobody wants to read political stuff. It's good for you. It's the broccoli. So, and in fact, as George Bernard Shaw said, if you're going to tell people the truth, you better make them laugh or they'll kill you. And especially if you're talking about doctors.
I've actually just read that quote recently and thought, oh yeah, absolutely, that's true. Well, thank you so very much. This was really enjoyable. I really enjoyed hearing more about the story, and it's a great research, great story. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you, Maria, and thank you to the Palisades Library. Yeah, absolutely. Chris.
I have a question, and I'll do a little full disclosure. My photo studio is next to Greta's writing studio over at Palisades, and I do know there's no internet there, which drives me crazy. But I noticed you share your studio with painters, not other writers. Is that on purpose?
Well, it just happened by chance that when I wrote the first book, I went and rented studio space from the League of Our Own, which is that other door. And I just was looking for a cheap place to go to get out of my house so I could concentrate. And they had space available, and I didn't take up very much space. They were glad to have me because the painter needs a lot more space. So then when I wanted to work on the second book, it worked so well for me, I just went back to Belllands and said, do you have any place? And again, it was painters that were looking for somebody. And I think I'm the only writer in the building. But it's lovely to be surrounded by a lot of creative energy. And my roommates are not very busy. They don't come in very much, so it doesn't interrupt me.
I'm curious about the word quack. Quack is highly pejorative in our use of it. And I understand as a title that really helps to sell the book because it makes you interested right away. Right. But we don't know whether she was really a quack. Do you know the intricacy of her medicine?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. This is the whole research process. And so the word quack, because it was so pejorative, I decided to just own it right from the start. Because originally I thought, well, write a defense of her. And that's weak. And I think it's much stronger to own the slander and then look at the truth afterwards.
Was it a word that was actually used about her?
Absolutely. Overtly. She was called a snake who was destroying the health of her community. I mean, the attacks on her were really, really fierce.
Well, it's interesting to me because I assumed she really was a quack, and then you said that her patients came back time after time, so it must have been, the medicines must have been somewhat efficacious.
Well, this is the big mystery. We have, of course, no data to prove anything, but one of the most dramatic scenes in my book is from Cora's baby diary. Mrs. Dr. Keck helped her when her daughter, which is my grandmother, was sick. And I have, again, just this tiny little pinhole of information into how she might have gone about treating her patients. So that's one of the featured things in the Charmed Line. It starts off with the scene of Cora with her little girl who's sick, and how does she interact with her mother? What does her mother do for her? And I think it gives us a lot of insight into how Mrs. Dr. Keck might have interacted with her other patients.
I just want to say something about that, because to me that was just so fascinating in the way that you unfolded the mystery of whether or not she was a quack. And in some ways, I have small children at home, and I'm not saying that doctors are quacks, but I had to find a doctor who wouldn't give my kid antibiotics every single time he had a cough. You know what I mean? So I think, I'm not saying that they're quacks, but I'm just saying that sometimes just doing nothing, which sometimes I think is what she did, was just so much more beneficial to people. Like, for instance, the burn treatment that I referenced of doctors would put a varnish on a burn, so anyway.
And medicine is indeed an art, and I also go to great lengths in the Charmed Mind to highlight how the regular doctors at the time made huge advances, and some of the things they did were fabulous. So I don't want it to seem like it's an either or, all and nothing, particularly in public health. I have a whole chapter about the last cholera epidemic in America in 1873. That was a hell of a year. And what the doctors did, and then the Surgeon General's report afterwards is fascinating because it gives us a vision of all these doctors, from the most old and incompetent to the newest, smartest ones, and how, even without understanding germ theory, how much those people were able to do. A lot of them were really, really smart, and they were building modern medicine right in front of your eyes. So I'm going to put that into the book in a big way. But nevertheless, everybody has a different idea what's the right way to handle certain types of things. And so over-medication has always been a phenomenon since day one. And patients often, they feel like they want to get their money's worth. Oh, if you're not giving me any medicine, why did I come in here? Well, maybe no medicine is the right thing. So.
I'm taking questions from the audience.
This is really more of a comment because, because we're able to see my English. I did
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. That there's definitely a line in the Quack's Daughter that she didn't deliver babies, she didn't do cholera, she wasn't fighting those kinds of battles. But nevertheless, there's huge numbers of people that suffer from chronic problems. And this thing that her specialty is this thing in those days they called chronic catarrh. What was that meaning? That took me years to figure out what was everyone talking about. What it meant was untreated infections in your sinuses and so forth. And in those days, in a world with no antibiotics, people's bones started to disintegrate and fall out through their noses. And they went deaf, they had no hearing and roaring in their ears for years. It was a horrifying thing. So if she could figure out some way to dry out a situation like that, probably a lot of nursing protocol was part of it, good nutrition, air, I don't know what all the things might have been, that people would have been incredibly grateful. And the regular doctors, we know for sure, could not have done anything better because they did not have antibiotics.
And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on, the possibility that these tonics might be herbal, medicines that we know that could work, that she might have had the knowledge of, I'm not quite sure even what to call it, but to go out into the meadows and collect these plants that could become tonics and pills.
Yeah, I have a chapter about what was typical in that era and typical stuff, and that was indeed widespread knowledge, and most people knew how to get basic things, like that Wakefield's blackberry balsam was a standard remedy that you would find in any cookbook. Blackberry bark was astringent and was very helpful for stopping diarrhea. So he just happened to have a patent medicine. I mean, it's much easier to go to the store and buy patent medicine than to make your own. So it didn't mean there was anything different than what you might make your own, but it was just convenient.
Well, I think also because people kept coming back and liking her, so I think it's a lot of her listening to people. And, that individual kind of talking to them, because I see that all the time with people who, it's not always what doctors do well, but how to treat people. It makes a big difference. And even if you can't totally help them, the attention, and it's amazing. And I think that's one of her things. Of course, she had some things that, work too, but that's it.
No, you're absolutely right. That in those testimonials she got from editors and from various people, the thing that comes through was that she was a wonderful listener, and she projected a sense of kindness and concern and caring to everybody. And that's a gift. It's an incredible gift.
Any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much.